Laszlo Fabin rose from Sofia Albizi's bed before her skin had cooled. She left her arm across her eyes, still breathless and trembling, still euphoric even as she pressed back the sting that rose behind her eyelids. He was right to leave. They had agreed they wouldn't do this anymore, not after they'd almost been caught when they'd hooked up at a royal wedding in Monaco 2 weeks ago. They'd managed to resist each other for 3 days here in Geneva, barely making eye contact, as they saw each other in passing at high-level trade development meetings. But she'd made the mistake of sitting in on his presentation on foreign investment. She loved to hear him talk almost as much as she loved the way he made her feel. He was passionate and stimulating, intelligent and insightful. He took the lead in every interaction, assertive and powerful. Privately, he was capable of charm and finesse and compassion. He fascinated her, so it set fire to her chest that he didn't linger after their intense lovemaking. But this was just a convenience for both of them. That's all it could be. Laszlo was the president of Sofia. When he'd been elected 2 years ago, he'd ousted a corrupt dictator who'd been causing unrest throughout the Balkan Peninsula. Sofia was the daughter of the kinky king of Valia. Despite how scrupulously she conducted herself to make up for that, she couldn't afford this arrangement being discovered, and neither could Laszlo. Her father was an immoral. She was supposed to have better control of herself. She was supposed to become the queen of Valia, and a tiny part of her was holding out for that, doing what had to be done so it could happen. Deep down, however, she knew she and Laszlo were using the protection of their reputations as an excuse to avoid the deeper, harder questions. She was. Did he care for her at all? Even if he did, what sort of future could they make for themselves? What were they prepared to give up for a relationship? Laszlo sat on the bed to put on his shoes. Sofia was instantly drawn to come up on an elbow and smooth the back of his shirt. He seemed to swell, spine straightening, as though her lightest caress filled him in some way. It was exhilarating to be this powerful, but the way he stood and turned and wore such a forbidding expression told her he resented her effect on him. Mio Dio, he was beautiful though, with sharp, angular features, dark hair, and stern brows. His eyes were such a startling blue, she wanted to wear it as her signature color. Are you going to the climate change forum next month? He tied his tie. Yes. She spoke with too much eagerness. She saw his dismay in the way he flicked his gaze to the side. Then I'll send someone else. Crushed, she quickly turned her back on him, sliding to the far side of the bed so he wouldn't see how he'd knocked the breath out of her.
Sofia.
His voice rang with frustration. No, you're right, she insisted, forcing words past the tightness in her throat, her stomach in knots. I'd rather not see you either. She dragged the sheet with her as she stood and adopted a regal demeanor as she faced him. She had learned this cool, unbothered smile from her mother. Not that she'd been old enough to understand that the former queen had used it to hide her pain. Her mother had gone to great lengths to protect Sofia and her twin Luca from learning what an irredeemable man their father was. In the 20 years since her mother's death, Sofia had seen all his dissolute ways, though. Her country was a laughingstock. Sofia wanted more for Valia, and her indulging in little trysts was not the way to go about it. Goodbye, Laszlo. This time we mean it, see. He didn't nod, didn't speak, didn't move. Only his cheek ticked. She was the one who turned away. It took every ounce of her strength to walk into the bathroom. An ache bloomed in her chest. Come with me, she willed him as she started the shower. Her eyes were clenched against a sting of longing, every breath burning her lungs. He didn't follow, and she went through the motions of washing his scent from her skin. Laszlo pulled the door closed, locking himself out of Sofia's life once and for all. None of the people hovering in the hall looked at him. Every single one was paid well enough to call that a breakout meeting on world affairs under oath, if it came to it. Igor was paid so well, he had ensured the president of Prasovia had been given a room on the same floor as the Princess of Valia. He followed Laszlo into his suite. "Will there be anything more, sir?" "We'll return home tonight. I'll make the arrangements." It felt like a retreat, but Laszlo had sworn he wouldn't go to her again, and yet here he was, imagining washing himself in that shower with her, soaping her smooth skin, drinking her sighs as he brought her to orgasm with the rhythm of his touch. She had bewitched him from the first moment he'd seen her 2 years ago, when she'd mediated trade talks with Prasovia and their contentious Eastern European neighbors. Laszlo had just won a brutal campaign and was determined to rescue his country from high taxes, poor infrastructure, and regressive policies. He'd been receiving death threats every other day, and initially tried to dismiss Sofia as an elitist pushing sweetheart deals for corporate interests. She had been impossible to ignore. She was knowledgeable and determined, painstakingly neutral, and committed to the betterment of all. In short, magnificent. He had fought his infatuation for months, and the day the agreement was signed, managed a private conversation to thank her. He couldn't say how they'd wound up locking lips, but their discussion had dissolved into torrid and frantic lovemaking, with regret on both sides. Princess Sofia was even more diligent about protecting her reputation than he was his. The only dirt anyone could dig up on her was her flawed pedigree. She was the daughter of the most debauched leader in modern Europe. The king of Valia had slept with Prasovia's first lady, while Laszlo's predecessor had watched, if rumors were to be believed. Such rumors were always believed. Laszlo was still cleaning house within Prasovia's government. He was under constant scrutiny and should have been courting a potential wife, subtly conveying his confidence in Prasovia's stability and prosperity, not having midnight hookups with anyone, let alone her. His countrymen might have seen past a bachelor having an affair. Maybe they would even accept his involvement with a princess if she renounced her title, since Prasovia's recovering democracy needed distance from supreme rulers like royalty and oligarchs. But the daughter of the kinky king, absolutely not. Why take the risk to see her at all, he kept asking himself. Because he couldn't stay away was the ignominious answer. As a man trying to prove himself ruled by only Prasovia's best interests, he couldn't allow himself to be ruled by his insatiable desire for Sofia. So Laszlo made his staff travel home at this ungodly hour. He made himself leave so he wouldn't give in to his basest urges. He made himself pretend, made himself believe nothing would ever happen between them again. It made him impossible, and the staff avoided him for several days afterward. On a quiet afternoon, Igor approached. "Sir," he said with a note of concern, "there's a headline in the news the king of Valia has died." Solentsy was Laszlo's first thought. Sunshine. It was the name he'd used for her private number. As he drew out his own phone, he saw no message from her. Why would she reach out, though? They were little better than one-night stands to one another. Weren't they? Where is she? His chest hurt. The loss for her would be complicated, but she would be suffering. The princess was still in Geneva when he passed. Why, the conference was long over. A rasping lick of jealousy briefly swept over him, along with a kick of self-recrimination. If he wanted her to be faithful, he had to give her a reason to be, didn't he? She's on her way home. Igor proved himself worth every lek Laszlo paid him as he said, "I'll learn what I can about the funeral arrangements and organize your attendance." Sofia only saw Laszlo briefly in the receiving line. Her heart nearly exploded, and she had to fight to maintain her composure when he gave her gloved hand a firm, lingering squeeze. His presence here wasn't personal, she reminded herself. He was doing what was expected by all world leaders, and like many others, had come for the chance to rub shoulders with their peers. No one truly mourned her father. She couldn't say she was particularly sorry for the loss herself. Her father's endless scandals were over, but his death upended her world. She didn't make it to the climate change forum the following month, too busy supporting her twin as Luca took up the mantle of ruling Valia. After they'd endured decades of their father's neglect, the task was enormous, but that wasn't Luca's reason for trying to refuse the crown. Sofia is the rightful heir, Luca insisted heatedly to Valia's privy council. She was born first. Our father's choice in naming me was pure sexism. If Valia wants to redeem our world, standing our first point of order is to recognize the true monarch. He pointed at Sofia. The council refused to accept his abdication. Sofia felt robbed, but couldn't bring herself to throw Valia into further chaos by making a constitutional challenge. Her country was in good hands with Luca, far better than with their father. She recognized Luca as her king and was once again relegated to delegate roles. Between royal duties at home, she attended a forum on NGOs, an assembly on urban economics. And now was she the only one who saw the irony? She was at a meeting in Madrid on the international status of women. It had been 6 months since Geneva. She'd thought of Laszlo every day, sometimes squeezing her own hand and pretending it was his grip around her fingers. But she'd refused to look him up or ask her assistant for his whereabouts. They had agreed not to see one another again, and aside from his appearance at the service, she hadn't heard from him. They were nothing to one another. Forget about him, Sofia. She tried, but how could she? When she left her presentation with her entourage and came face to face with him in the wide hall of the conference center, her heart lurched and her whole body stung with a self-conscious blush. He halted, equally taken aback. After an awkward thump of time, he gave her a deferential nod. Princess. Absolutely nothing had changed. His wonderfully deep timbre was a velvety caress down her spine, but that standoffish air radiated around him. I can't do this. Of all the things she'd withstood in her life, seeing him and knowing she couldn't have him was the most agonizing. Mr. President, she didn't offer her hand, even though she normally would with any other dignitary. It was taking every ounce of control she possessed to disguise how thoroughly this meeting was shredding her composure. To be near him was to be alive, heart racing, skin hot. She longed to step into his wide-shouldered frame and let him envelop her. She wanted his mouth on hers, wanted to breathe the scent in his throat, wanted his rough voice against her ear, while his weight pinned her to the mattress. She said, I didn't see your name on the attendance list. Or I wouldn't have come. It's nice to see you again. I'm at economy and the environment. He pointed down the hall. If she was having any effect on him, he was even better at hiding it. His expression remained stiffly polite, nothing more, which was an even sharper kick in the stomach than their last goodbye. I won't keep you, she said with her own well-practiced and very bland smile. There was an incendiary flash in his sharp blue eyes. It could have been a reflection from something outside. Nonetheless, it made her feel as though the ground shifted beneath her feet. Her step faltered as they both continued on their way. She was still trying to make sense of that moment when she left another session having heard exactly none of it. Her assistant handed her an envelope. It contained one of the hotel's folders with a keycard and a room number written inside. Her stomach sank, but her heart soared. T had been 6 months since Laszlo had shaken her gloved hand at her father's funeral. 6 months of telling himself to forget about her. He had no appetite for other women, however. Sofia dominated his thoughts. When he gave in to temptation and looked at headlines and photos of her, he thought she appeared to have lost weight. She wasn't his to be concerned about, but he was, despite having hundreds of concerns of his own. He was on legitimate business to restructure his country's economy. Yet when he'd bumped into her, nothing had mattered beyond watching her mouth form words. The world held color again. He could taste and smell and feel his blood moving in his veins, while she had been her most aloof, contained self. That air of remoteness itched at him. He was definitely a man who was stimulated by challenge, but this was more than a desire to break through her walls and get a reaction. He was infatuated, bordering on obsessed. He didn't like it. It made him feel as though he had a flank open, all the more reason to ignore her. Knowing she was so close had a fire bursting forth inside him. When Igor asked tentatively, "Sir, should I?" he cut in with a firm yes. He hated himself for the weakness, but passing her a key would put the decision in her hands. At least he would know if this grinding ache inside him was reciprocated. He had his answer 2 hours later when he returned to his room, and it was empty. Good. He ordered food and poured himself a scotch, telling himself he was glad she had more sense than he did. When the door lock hummed a few minutes later, he turned, with his breath held. Solence. She still wore her crisp pencil skirt, and matching jacket still had her light brown hair up in its smooth twist. Her eyes were cool blue behind her glasses, but she brought light and warmth no matter where she went. That was what he had felt when he'd run into her downstairs, the sensation of emerging from a cave into spring sunshine. A bright day suddenly filled with possibility. She shut the door and leaned on it. The way her teeth tortured her bottom lip said, "I'm weak. I hate myself for being here." That was a shard of glass straight into his heart. Perhaps they were the instrument of each other's destruction. He set his drink aside and strode across the room to press her into that door. She was the only thing that could have stopped him from making her his, and she didn't. Aside from a small gasp of surprise, there was only welcome in the part of her lips and her soft moan of capitulation. He thanked his lucky stars because he was starved for her. He devoured her mouth, drinking in the faint taste of coffee and the way her skin smelled of vanilla like always. The most intoxicating thing about her, however, was the way she pressed her pelvis into his. Whatever she was wearing was too much. He swept his hands over her, trying to find her curves, searching out those places he could pull away fabric and find skin. Her clever hands were just as determined, her mouth equally greedy. When she sucked against the side of his neck, he grew more inflamed at being marked by her. She was the only woman he'd ever known who was so sexually aggressive, and it turned him on intensely. It made him equally fierce in his determination to gather her up and glorify and gorge himself on her. He wanted to overwhelm her completely, take her to the floor, and let the world listen to him, making her his. But he had one last shred of civility in him and brought her to the bedroom. His was what Sofia needed more than anything. Torrid passion that stole her thoughts and overwhelmed her senses. To feel wanted, needed. To feel completely in sync with this man who seemed to know exactly where her body yearned to be touched. He stalled them at the foot of the bed, where he cupped the back of her neck and used his other hand to lock her hips to his. She was tall, only a few inches shorter than him, so they were perfectly matched as he tenderly ravaged her mouth until she was combing frantic fingers through his hair. Then his mouth went to her throat, and they began to sweep clothing away. There were things she ought to be saying. All the reasons were still there for why this shouldn't happen, but it had been too long since she'd felt sensual and excited and alive. She had missed him so much and poured that emotion over him, streaking her hands across the fine hairs on his chest, running her touch to the tense muscles in his abdomen, peeling open his trousers to caress him in a way that had his breath rasping in his throat. She went to her knees, dragging his pants and briefs to his ankles, then clasped his erection in her fist and began to pleasure him with her lips and tongue. His guttural groan was everything, making her smile around the salty heat that filled her mouth. His hand cupped her cheek, knocking her glasses askew. He took them off, and she didn't know where they went, but didn't care. She was determined to give him this. "Stop," he growled. "I won't last." "I don't want you to," he swore and pulled her to her feet as he kicked out of his pants. He sat on the edge of the bed in only his socks and open shirt and dragged her to him. He hitched her skirt up to her waist so she could straddle his thighs. She had one moment of recalling that they were backsliding into a place they'd sworn to avoid, but his hands were palming her bottom through the lace of her panties. "Give me your nipple," he said in that primitive voice, and she obeyed, pulling down the cup of her bra, then bracing her arms on his shoulders. She abandoned herself to him then. No one else had ever made her feel consumed by fire. Lightning shot from where he rolled his tongue against her nipple to detonate in wet heat between her thighs. She bucked in his lap, seeking pressure against the ache that was becoming unbearable. He obligingly slipped 2 fingers under the lace, moaning his gratification as he found her slippery and welcoming. She hugged his head, rocking against his touch, whispering a plea. Because she was weak. So weak, he drew the fabric aside, and the blunt, velvety tip of him probed. With a shaken sigh, she let her weight settle her onto his thick intrusion. For these few minutes, they were one. This ferocious, consuming hunger wasn't just in her. They both suffered it. She looked into his glazed eyes as she began to rise and sink, taking him in a luxurious rhythm while he stroked her thighs beneath her skirt, guiding her, encouraging her to take her fill of him. Her flesh was so greedy she was peaking in moments breath-shattering while she sobbed in loss because she didn't want it to be over yet. "Laszlo!" she gasped with anguish caught in the crosshairs of joy and sorrow. "Let it happen, Solensi." She had no choice. She was falling apart while he held her in his strong arms and watched her giving small thrusts of his hips to increase her pleasure as she rode the powerful waves of her orgasm. After long moments, when she was still trying to catch her breath, he carefully withdrew, still hard. He set her on her back on the mattress and leaned over her with a feral smile as he drew her underwear down and off, then tossed it away. "Let's do it properly now, shall we?" He went to his knees beside the bed, draped her thighs over his shoulders, and bent to the business of arousing her all over again. "Harder!" Sofia gasped, bracing her hands against the headboard. This was what made her spectacular. She knew what she wanted, what she needed. She wasn't afraid to demand it and take it. And she was so beautiful, like this flushed and naked back arched, so her breasts stood high and proud legs over his straining arms. Laszlo was a very headstrong, autonomous man, but in this moment, he thought he could live the rest of his life in service to making this woman mindless with pleasure. Nothing else existed when they were like this, except the friction of their bodies, the tear of their panting breaths, the sweet clasp of her as he drove himself into her, and the exquisite chills of approaching climax that raced across his skin. "Tell me when," he said, not sure which language she used. It was taking everything in him to wait for her. He fought the culmination that teased in the base of his spine, holding back while he watched her lashes flutter and her lips part, holding back until she cried out. He let go, vision turning white as he slammed into her in an uneven primal rhythm. Acute pleasure exploded within him, and he was nearly wrenched apart by the intensity of his orgasm. Sensation sharpened and softened and convulsed his muscles as her flesh quivered thrillingly around his. They held like that for eternity, as though trapped in golden amber. He wished that's exactly what happened, that they were frozen in ecstasy forever. But the waves of euphoria slowly faded, and his arms weakened, and he melted onto her. He tried not to crush her as he sank down, but there really was no more delightful place to settle than upon her damp and quivering body, while still shaking with their shared pleasure. He wanted to set his teeth against her neck like a damned animal, keeping his mate exactly where he wanted her. He had to dispose of the condom, however. He gathered his strength and touched a kiss to her closed eye as he withdrew. When he came back, she had gathered her clothes and stood with them clutched to her naked breasts. Not this time was the emphatic barbaric imperative that rocketed around in his brain. That might have been how they did things in the past. Tonight he yanked the rumpled covers back and said in quiet, implacable command, "Get into this bed." She lifted her brows and snorted, her front arms firming across the drape of her clothes, pinning them to her stomach. Her mouth tightened, and a small wrinkle appeared on her brow. "I really can't linger, but there's something I should tell you." She turned to drop her clothing into the chair and began to dress back, bowing as she stepped into her underpants and drew the jewel-green lace to cup her pretty round ass. "I had a pregnancy scare last time." Laszlo was so taken aback his foot bumped into the night table with a sharp jab he barely felt. The world was a harsh, terrible place where harrowing, life-altering things happened all the time. This news shouldn't be such a surprise. Maybe the fact it didn't feel terrible surprised him most. "I don't remember a condom breaking," Laszlo said behind her voice, difficult to read. "What happened?" "After you left Geneva, I realized I was late. I'd seen you in Monaco, and I'm usually like clockwork." Sofia hurried to dress, far too defenseless and raw after giving herself up to him so quickly and thoroughly. "I've since gone on the pill. It's totally fine." Then why tell him at all? Because it had been her excuse for coming here. Of course, she had fallen into his arms and his bed. Of course, she had shattered into a million pieces again and again. That's why seeing him was such an irresistible compulsion. He brought her a pleasure that was so intense it was almost pain. The pain was there, though, blanketed by kisses and caresses and the joyous joining of flesh. The reckoning afterward was always inevitable and excruciating. If she told him about the scare, she reasoned, maybe he would make it easier for her to resist him in the future. Maybe the next time they met in a hallway, he would only nod and pass her by, as if they were the acquaintances they pretended to be. Maybe he would find another woman to offer his room key to. Mio Dio, that was a sickening thought. You should have texted me. I would have come back. There was nothing you could do. I told my team I had food poisoning, and they had a private doctor brought in. He gave me a pregnancy test. It was negative, and he said it might be a low body fat issue since I've been running more this year. "Have you had follow-up tests?" he asked gruffly. "Are you sure it's not something more serious?" He stepped into his briefs. "I'm fine. The royal physician had given her a physical and offered to freeze her eggs since she was 31 and not planning to have children yet. I'm perfectly healthy, but it was stressful to realize I had worked so hard all my life to walk the straight and narrow, then come this close. She pinched her finger and thumb together, to landing up in that age-old position of being unwed and pregnant, unable to tell anyone who the father is. You can bet the press would have equated it to all of my father's antics. Never mind how humiliating that would have been for me and Luca. I can't do that to him. More reason to never see Laszlo again, but she couldn't say it out loud. She tucked in her blouse, then zipped up her skirt and smoothed it down her hips. Laszlo stood there in his briefs, hands on his hips, watching her. He was like a bronze god with his honed muscles, flat hips, and thick thighs. She swallowed, still high on sex endorphins, trying to talk herself into leaving. I would have married you, he said bluntly. Sofia dropped the jacket she hadn't realized she was holding. She picked it up and gave it a shake, trying to knock his words from her head. Don't you mean you would have proposed and breathlessly awaited my response? Sure. His tone was more amusement than agreement. Laszlo was not quite as civilized as men were supposed to be these days. And when you said yes, I would have married you. So chivalrous. No. He came around the bed and took the jacket she was trying to put on. He threw it onto the chair and set his hands on her waist, gently tugging her hips into his own. He was both fascinated and infuriated by the way she could lift her chin aloof and self-possessed, as if she hadn't been begging him for everything he had 20 minutes ago. If he hadn't felt the faint tremble in her fingers where they rested on his naked chest, he would have been annoyed and let her go, but she wasn't nearly as unaffected as she was pretending. I lost my father when I was 12. I wouldn't leave my child fatherless. Her expression softened, making his heart unsteady. You never talk about your father. You never talk about yourself, she added with a wry twist of her mouth. Too busy with other things, he said, caressing beneath her ear. Always short on time. Her gaze shifted to the clock on the night table, and his chest tightened. My father was killed in a professional hit. He dropped his hands and moved to look for his shirt. He jabbed his arms into the sleeves, chilled by his own words, but refusing to cling to her as he relayed them. The man who ordered his death lives comfortably in exile. I continued trying to have him extradited so I can bring him to justice, but may never succeed. That's not a legacy I want to put on a child. My mother was left to raise me alone. I would never force such a challenge on the mother of my own child if I could avoid it. Her expression was difficult to read, soft, yet conflicted and distressed. I'm not as vulnerable as most women, she pointed out. And I loathe the idea of a man marrying me because he had to. If you wanted to marry me, you would have asked by now. He supposed he deserved that. But after their first time, she'd been even more concerned about keeping them a secret than he had, so he was compelled to ask, Is that what you want? What? Marriage, a future, family. We've never talked about this being anything more than... He tried to find a word that wouldn't make it sound cheap, because it wasn't. Too busy with other things? She repeated facetiously, though he heard a pang of hurt in her tone. So talk. Tell me what you want. And you'll make it happen, she scoffed. Maybe. He pulled on his pants. Tell me and we'll see. He zipped. She snorted and turned away from him. Arms crossed profile, working with deep inner struggling. She looked to the floor hair falling forward to curtain her face, then she warily lifted her lashes. What do you want? He had the sense of a childish struggle between them. You let go first. No, you. He pushed his hands in his pockets. The sex is fantastic. I want that, he drawled. Tsk. Her cheek went pink, and she looked to the floor again. So you want to keep doing this? You can have that with anyone. Like hell, he said with affront, and crossed the room to open her arms and softly crash her into him. Are you saying you feel this way with other men? He cupped his hands possessively over her ass, pinning her hips to his, while she wedged her arms between them and scowled. No, she admitted, but nothing has changed. We're still who we are. Anything more than this is impossible. Things have changed. For both of us, Laszlo insisted. When this started, you had just mediated our trade agreement. You were afraid your neutrality would be called into question if we went public with our involvement. We're past that. Our dating wouldn't reflect badly on you now. On my side, I was new enough in my position I couldn't afford to be linked to the daughter of a man with an image problem. Now I have a stronger record, and I'd be dating the sister of the Golden Prince, a king who has never made a mistake in his life. Sofia gently extricated herself and sank onto the foot of his bed, considering his words. Has he made a mistake? Laszlo asked. Is there something you're not telling me? She sent an ironic glance upward. There were many things they didn't tell each other. This was the longest, most personal conversation they'd ever had. Did he realize that? Luca is every bit as scrupled as I am, probably more. Like her, he had been hemmed in his entire life by nannies and mentors and advisors, all hired by their mother to ensure they upheld the morals their father had abandoned. Luca was still trying to convince the Privy Council to let her take the crown, trying to right their father's wrong. Sofia couldn't tell Laszlo that, however. It bordered on treason that she was still chafed at being passed over. But was there a silver lining to that injustice? Rather than living her life in careful preparation for the slim possibility she would ascend, could she embrace a less exalted and more humble role? One that allowed her to become involved with the president of Prasovia. I still have to live a very faultless life. If something happens, I'm first in line for the throne. Think about what that would mean to you if it came to pass. That's not likely, he dismissed too easily. Your brother is healthy, and if he's as duty-conscious as you are, will marry quickly. You won't be next in line for long. There would still be a lot of pressures and expectations on both of us. Are you willing to put up with that for an affair? It would be different if we were in love, but... She lifted her questioning gaze. His face became a blank slate, and he stepped away. I don't expect that, she lied. We barely know one another. I know you, he asserted, pivoting to confront her. I know you're taking that tone right now because I've hurt you by not stating unequivocally that I'm in love and willing to do whatever it takes to be together. I know how to touch you to make you wild. I know when you walk into a crowded auditorium without hearing or seeing you. I know that your brother is probably the only person you genuinely trust, and that hurts me. Is that it then? She looked at her hands in her lap, stunned by all he had said. At length, she asked, You can't open your heart to me because I don't share state secrets. I didn't say I don't care for you. His stare was hard enough, it nearly knocked her flat onto the mattress. I'd closed myself off to strong feelings when my mother died, and what I feel for you is nothing like what I remember of the love I had for her. This is a greedy ache in the pit of my stomach, a hunger to have you beside me all the time. I want our lives so intertwined. There are no secrets, state or otherwise, that I can't share with you. Laszlo, she breathed, so moved her eyes stung. I want that too. Sofia wanted to tell her brother before they made any moves in public. Have we not done away with those antiquities? Laszlo asked with genuine irritation. He'd be damned if he'd ask anyone's permission to court her except hers. Things are still very delicate at home. She insisted, but she stayed the night. Waking beside her, stretching out his arm to drag her sleepy, sighing body into the spoon of his was the best way to wake. Even better was their love-making lazy and without the usual cloud of shouldn't and hurry hanging over them. "My brother owns a castle," Sofia said as she put on a hotel robe after they showered the next morning. "We could use it this summer if we can find a shared week." "I'll tell Igor." There was a firm knock on the suite's front door. They locked gazes. "1 minute," Laszlo called and pulled on the other robe, then left the bedroom to answer the door. Igor stood in the hallway with Sofia's assistant. The young woman wore a shoulder bag and an expression of extreme agitation. "I'm sorry to interrupt your breakfast meeting, sir," she said. "I wonder if the princess has checked her messages." "Are we in the news?" Laszlo asked Igor, waving for the assistants to come inside. "The King of Valia has been caught in a compromising photo." Igor clicked his phone to show King Luka caught backlit by the sunset on a palace balcony, naked as the day he was born. Judging by the blurred section of the image, he was intensely aroused by the very beautiful and curvaceous blonde he was embracing. "This might be a good time for you to be seen downstairs," Igor suggested. "Alone?" Laszlo mentally dug in his heels. Igor's advice was sound. It was one thing for Laszlo to appear at galas with a woman whose family scandals were behind her. It was another thing to be caught with her while a fresh one made headlines. Still, it felt disloyal to even think of abandoning Sofia in her moment of vulnerability. She came out of the bedroom and faltered, probably because he wore such a thunderous expression. What was wrong with the men in her family that they couldn't keep it in their pants, or at least keep their affairs private like he and Sofia managed to do? Her clothes were different from last night's. Her damp hair was twisted up, and she wore enough makeup that if she was spotted leaving his room, this could be passed off as the breakfast meeting her assistant had labeled it. Even so, Laszlo could tell she was shaken beneath her veneer. His heart lurched. "I need a moment with the president." Gone was the smoky-voiced, languorous lover he'd awoken to. She was Princess Sofia, collected and regale. Their assistants stepped outside and Sofia nervously licked her lips. "This changes things," she began. Her hands were clasped so tightly he wanted to pry them apart and hold them. Soothe her and tell her no, it didn't. But he had to be honest. "A little," he agreed. "It would be better to wait for this to blow over before we—" "It won't," she cut in. "I think—" Her mouth trembled and she pressed her lips flat, searching his eyes. "Laszlo, I don't think this photo was an accident. I think Luka meant for it to happen." "What, why?" "I was born first," she said with a shrug of simplicity. "When our father learned my mother was pregnant with twins, he named the boy his successor and never allowed anyone to question it. When he died, Luka tried to refuse the crown so I could have it, but the Privy Council wouldn't permit it. I didn't have a legitimate reason to challenge him. He was trained for the role of sound mind and well without blemish." "You think he's giving you a reason?" "I can hardly believe it either. I knew he hadn't given up, but this—" "You knew your taking the crown was likely and didn't tell me," he asked, astounded. "I didn't know, but I alluded to it yesterday when I said anything could happen." Her chin came up. There were flags of red standing on her cheekbones. "I told you to think about how you would feel if it did," he snorted, feeling lied to. "I said I wanted there to be no secrets between us and you withheld the most important one you have. This isn't something I can talk about with just anyone." He wasn't as angry about that as he was about the fact that she immediately felt far beyond his reach. What had he imagined? That after they dated for a time, she would renounce her title, put on an apron, and stand in his shadow.
You're going to do it, challenge him,
He demanded. Luca has sacrificed himself to give me this chance. I have to. Tears stood on her lashes. She wouldn't want their on and off affair muddying the waters while she did. Why did this feel like such a rejection? They weren't even properly dating. They had talked about seeing where this relationship would go. Like middle graders asking to go steady. Even so, he felt as though his heart was being carved out as he said, "Good luck," and nodded stiffly. Her head went back and she gusted out, "Thank you." She might have sniffed as she turned away. He opened his mouth to call her back, but the door was already closed.